Yes, we are live now.
Dr. Simon.
Well, a very warm good morning to all of you. It's a bright and sunny day, and it's beginning to get warmer by the minute. And today we have gathered here for a very fine webinar with a very interesting topic, myths and archetypes in popular culture. And we have an extremely talented and versatile resource person, Dr. Shyaonti Talwar, and she would be our main spokesperson today in presenting her views on the topic. I'm very happy that so many others have plugged in and joined in. And the moment myths and archetypes, we read these words, so many things come flooding to our minds. And my take on it is mythology also. Greek mythology, Roman mythology, and Norse mythology. And archetypes brings to my mind Carl Jung also. So I hope we have a fantastic interaction session today. And we are being assisted by Dr. Melva Pope. She is Associate Professor in the Department of English. And there'll be Dr. Isaac Ghosh also. He is also Associate Professor in the Department of English. And the English department is actively involved in various cultural and literary activities. And the department as a whole acts as a mentor for our students. We prepare them for English quiz. We prepare them for essay writing, for debating skills, for declamation, and also for one-act plays in which St. John's College does very well. And we have a very patronizing principal in the form of Dr. Shailen Pratap Singh. We miss him in the English department because prior to becoming principal, he was associate professor in the Department of English. So after having welcomed all of you to a very fine session this morning, which goes into noon, I now invite and welcome our principal, Dr. Shailen Pratap Singh, who will be addressing you on behalf of the staff of St. John's College and St. John's College itself. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. It is indeed a great privilege for us to welcome all of you on behalf of the Department of English and on behalf of St. John's College into this webinar. Myth and archetypes always evoke a lot of interest. Archetypes reside in our unconscious mind and influence us without our being aware of them. All our decisions, our emotional responses, our taste, and our preferences are in a way influenced by them. Understanding and mapping their influence can indeed enable us to be more effective in planning our interventions for behavioral changes. Often we find that in post-structuralist theory, various theorists have often accused Jung of reinforcing cultural prejudices through archetypes, as they contend that they can't be universal as they are discursively constructed. Nevertheless, the idea of archetypes help us to understand the collective human behavior and account for otherwise many inexplicable choices which are often made by people and communities at large. I take this opportunity to congratulate the entire Department of English for hosting this webinar, and we are indeed privileged to have a very dynamic and a very versatile resource person for the day. And very soon, we are going to hear about her, one of the most suitable person to address this theme. And now I would request Dr. Isaac Ghosh to give a brief introduction of the resource person. We can't hear you, Dr. Ghosh. I can do is just give a brief 30 seconds introduction of the speaker, and then later on towards the vote of thanks, a proper introduction of her could be given. Dr. Shyaonti Talwar did her PhD from University of Mumbai, and she has authored 2 books, and she started her career as a reporter, and she has been very closely, very deeply engaged with popular culture. She is the editor. She has been editor and has been a contributor, regular contributor to Times of India, and also has very frequently contributed to a lot of magazines related to Bollywood. In that capacity, she had opportunity to interview all the major movie stars, and she has watched popular culture very closely. She also has a research interest spanning from gender studies and film theory and various other ELT and various other areas that she has been keenly engaged with. She is also a resource person for British Council, and along with the British Councils, she has been taking sessions on ELT, various themes related to ELT, on teacher development, on critical thinking, and on various other issues that are of great interest. So probably a detailed and a proper introduction. She has published many papers and made many presentations, and one of the most capable individuals because to deliver on myth and archetypes. That is also the title of her upcoming book, which probably would be published soon. So I take this opportunity, we'll have her detailed introduction later towards the close of this webinar. Now I take this opportunity to welcome and invite Dr. Shyaonti Talwar. Sonal ma'am, Dr. Talwar.
Thank you so much, sir. Am I audible? Okay. So thank you so much for that generous introduction, Singh sir. And thank you, the Department of English, St. John's College, Agra, for organizing this, and especially Dr. Isaac Ghosh, who took this initiative, and Dr. S.P. Singh, who has been very proactive throughout, Sonal ma'am, the technical support, who has very kindly consented to moderate this session, and Dr. Simon for that initial introduction. I gather that I'm looking at an interactive session on myths and archetypes in popular culture. And I am going to look at myths and archetypes through films and celebrities and their brand images. Now, I thought that we could use this approach rather than the theoretical approach, because I understand that this is a very diverse group of participants. We have academicians, we have people who are into media studies, people from marketing, advertising, and then there are PhD students, and there are also people who have a general interest in films or myths and archetypes. So, which is why my objective in this webinar would be to make it more comprehensible to you. And that is why I have chosen this fascinating and interesting route of conveying the notion of myths and archetypes through popular culture, through celebrities and brand images. Now, let's look at, right. So I'm going to ask you a question. You might see some pictures in front of you of Bollywood stars. Now, if I were to ask you, why do you think certain celebrities in films are more successful than others? Have you ever thought about it? Perhaps it is because they have an archetypal core and they have a mythic center. Now, I'm going to come to what I mean by an archetypal core or a mythic center, but as of now, I'd like you to register these phrases in mind. So, the idea is that when brands are built, celebrities are also brands. So, when brands are built or evolve around an archetype, or they have an archetypal nucleus, then they leave a lasting impression on the viewer's mind or on their audience's mind. And it is a permanent imprint on the psychic field. And by brand, I do not restrict this to, by brand image, I do not restrict this to celebrities, to Bollywood or film actors alone. I am also talking about people who could be from various walks of life, but who are in the limelight. So you might have a slide in front of you, which has people from different walks of life. Each of these people, if you look at our Prime Minister, Mother Teresa, Sri Ravi Shankar, a former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, the renowned cricketer and the captain of the Indian cricket team, Virat Kohli, all of them have an archetypal core. They wear an archetype which resonates with people. And that is why they are so popular, right? So, Mr. Modi ji embodies a mythic center. He is the archetypal embodiment of the story of rags to riches. Now, I don't mean by rags, I don't mean his financial condition. I, of course, mean his journey from that of being a nondescript party worker to holding the highest office of the land. If you look at Mother Teresa, you will find that she has the archetype of the caregiver. Spiritual masters, generally, the ones like Sri Ravi Shankar, would have the healer and the rescuer archetype. So, generally, when a person is in an emotional mess or facing some kind of crisis in life, they would seek healing from this kind of a person. Indira Gandhi, the former prime minister, the only woman prime minister we had, uh, very consciously embodied the archetype of the mother and the widow. So she conflated her image and her brand image with Mother India, and you have lots of scholarly studies on this. Virat Kohli, if you look at him and his body language and his posturing, he has changed the face of the Indian cricket team and he has the warrior archetype in him. So, this was just to give you an idea of how people wear their archetypes. And if they are wearing the right kind of archetype, they are going to, it is going to strike a chord with uh, the audience or the viewers or or it could be their fan following, whatever section of the population they are appealing to. If it's the right archetype, it resonates with people. So when actors, politicians, sports persons build their brand image around an appropriate archetype or play the archetype that best reflects them, or even choose an archetype which will appeal to the consumer or the viewer or the general populace, then they too are capable, like brands, they too are capable of leaving a permanent impression on the mind of people and influencing people. Now, but then sometimes it also happens that they don't wear the right kind of archetype, or maybe they have been embodying an archetype for too long, and it ceases to resonate any further with people. And that is when the time they need to understand that it is time to change their archetypal core. So, and they have to undergo a change of archetype. Now, we are going to look at one such celebrity. Now, on the screen in front of you, you have the big B, Amitabh Bachchan, of Bollywood, the iconic actor. Now, if you look at these three pictures of Amitabh, uh, every picture is labeled as per the archetype. Now, if I were to ask you that which of these pictures, which of these Amitabhs do you prefer? I'm sure most of you are going to say the one on the extreme left and the one on the right. The one in the middle didn't resonate that well, right? So, in fact, Amitabh Bachchan is one celebrity who has understood the significance or the importance of changing his archetype so that he can sustain or he can be an enduring image. He can last in the film industry, which is in a constant state of flux, right? So, in fact, if we look at the young Amitabh, he came to be associated with the archetype of the rebel or the angry young man in his youth. His films like Kala Patthar, Diwar, Coolie, starting with Zanjeer, which cast him in this archetype, were precisely because of this reason, because of the huge success and the huge fan following this rebel archetype generated. In fact, there were entire storylines and scripts that were written to fit into, that were written uh, exclusively for him so that keeping the rebel archetype in mind. They portrayed him as the underdog who rises despite all odds, but with a seething, simmering anger and reflects the anger of the masses against the establishment, which is both corrupt and indifferent. Now, with equal ease, if you look at this slide, with equal ease, he plays the knight archetype, who is not only characterized by physical strength, but also a certain level of mental resilience. Someone who is set on a mission to save and rescue and may encounter a lot of threats and personal dangers in the path of his journey. The knight, however, has to win. He is chivalrous and he's a savior, and then he has to stick to his role as a savior, even if that means giving up his life or self destruction. So, if you consider movies like Silsila, Sholay, Bemisal, and Mukaddar Ka Sikandar, they all show us glimpses of the knight who needs to come to the rescue of the one he loves, even if that puts his personal life and his well being at peril. Most of the time, he's also an orphan. This character, the knight and the rebel, is also an orphan who has been raised by foster parents, like in Amar Akbar Anthony or Mukaddar Ka Sikandar or even Baby Sal, or has been abandoned by his biological parents, like in Kala Patthar. But now coming back to this archetype, this was where perhaps it was the fag end of his first innings. So in this period, Bachchan's films like Jadugar, Tufan, which were released around the year 1989, then Agnipath in 1990, and Akela in 1991, most of which embody the Avenger archetype, couldn't do that well in the box office, despite Agnipath receiving huge critical acclaim, following which the actor announced his temporary retirement. It was clear that perhaps in the light of the string of the box office failures, with occasional hits like Hum and Shehenshah, this was the best course of action, and the interim period between 1992 and 2000, so that's 18 years, was not a very promising one for Amitabh Bachchan, who delivered forgettable films like Mrityu Data, Insaniyat, and Major Saab. So, viewer and critic responses both seem to indicate that perhaps the time had come for Mr. Bachchan to reinvent his archetypal brand image, which happened. And how did it happen? It happened decisively, definitively, and it confirmed a commercially and critically successful comeback for him, starting with the film Mohabbatein in 2000, in the year 2000. If you look at this film and his image in the film, the archetype he invoked in Mohabbatein was of the grand old patriarch, who may be solitary, who may be friendless, nonetheless, who is someone who is here to stay. Okay, and this was also closely associated with what he was going through at that point in time in his life. if you consider the series of box office failures and also the bankruptcy of his production company. In fact, so strong was the appeal of the patriarch that even its shadow, the shadow of the grand old patriarch in films like Aks and in films like Sarkar, was very well received by the audience. This archetype of the patriarch unequivocally reflected in an image makeover in Mr. Bachchan, with the salt and pepper hairdo and the beard, appealed to the audience and established him firmly to play his second innings in the entertainment business. Most of Mr. Bachchan's on screen films stick to the combination. And later, there was another archetype which he incorporated, and that was the wise old man archetype, which also spelled the success of his of the TV series Kaun Banega Crorepati. So uh, ever since these two archetypes, his on-screen presence has been defined by a combination of these two archetypes, of the grand old patriarch and of the wise old man or the sage archetype. So, and this comes through very strongly, especially in films like Pink. If you can see the poster of Pink, which is on the right-hand bottom of your screen, where the whole debate on the issue of sexual consent and the reconfiguration of ways of seeing a woman acquire legitimacy because they have the voice of the sage and the grand old patriarch, the ultimate voice of authority and wisdom through in the lawyer Deepak Sehgal, which is played by Amitabh Bachchan, and this voice is the voice of utmost authority and wisdom that could possibly dominate the popular cultural imaginary in a patriarchal society. Now, only occasionally has Mr. Bachchan veered from this combination to the archetype of a victim in the comic genre in movies like 102 Not Out, Piku, and Bhootnath. But even in these films, the characters he plays are defined by the same underlying wisdom and resilience. Exterior of obstinacy and irrational action of an old man. It is a wisdom that his archetypal silver screen identity reflects that lies behind the huge commercial success of the several seasons of KBC that are aired each year. In fact, if you remember, the show Kaun Banega Crorepati did experiment with another host in its third season, if I'm not mistaken, when it signed up Shahrukh Khan, but its popularity dropped. Now, why did this happen? Because Shahrukh Khan, in his own right, is a star in every way, but he didn't resonate with the audience as the host of KBC. Why? Because Shahrukh Khan simply does not have the sage archetype, right? The wise old archetype or the authoritative body language, the persona or the aura of the grand old patriarch. So his on-screen role of the quiz master of KBC demanded the archetype of the wise old man, which couldn't come through as Shah Rukh Khan embodies a very different archetype. And let's look at the archetype which he embodies. If you look at him, he embodies the archetype of the Eternus, which is Latin for lover boy. So Shah Rukh Khan is the eternal lover boy of Bollywood. And that is the image to which he owes the success of all his films. And that is how his brand image, his brand identity has been positioned in the popular imaginary of his audience. Well, most certainly he has stepped in occasionally, he has experimented with other archetypes, like he has stepped into the warrior archetype, for example, in movies like Ashoka and Chak De. But nowhere does the warrior archetype come even remotely close to the sage archetype or the grand old patriarch archetype. So that is how archetypes can make or break brands and people and define the trajectory of commercial success and popularity of an actor. Now, archetypal staging, when seen thus, becomes something bigger than the individual, more than the person who embodies it. Archetypal identities are enduring and they are compelling. People or products that do not have a defining or a very prominent archetype can very well have a limited shelf life and disappear from public memory. And it is also about, besides this, it is also about an archetype and its appeal in a particular context and in a particular socio-cultural milieu. Because again, society is informed by what Carl Jung calls the collective unconscious. Now, the lover boy, if we look at the lover boy archetype, the lover boy has always held a very, very special place in the Indian cultural imaginary, and it is very prominent. It's a very prominent archetype, probably because of the prominent presence of the mythological figure of of one of the gods, Krishna, in our mythology, who is very prominent not only in our mythology but in our religion, in certain in music, in literature, in poetry. So Krishna features as a very prominent figure. Now, the lover boy archetype was successfully donned by actors like Rajesh Khanna, Kumar Gaurav, and Rishi Kapoor, who in fact was known as the original lover boy. But it reached its zenith. It culminated in Shahrukh Khan, who, with his boyish looks, his dimples, and his irresistible charm, played the boy lover, where he could assert all his will against and his resolve against the establishment, act the rebel, and he could get or let go the girl he loved. So if you look at these movie, just to give you, just to remind you of the movies and the roles he has played, you can see that he is the eternal lover boy of Bollywood. Whether it's Dilwale Dulhania, right from Raju Ban Gaya Gentleman to Veer Zara. If you look at his enduring success, it is owing to this beautiful playing and enactment of the lover boy archetype. And so successful was he. In fact, he was successful to such an extent that even the shadow of the lover boy did very well in the box office, where he played the shadow of the archetype of the lover boy in films like Bazigar, Deewana, Dar, and Anjam. Now, I have deliberately chosen to talk about what archetypes can do instead of first defining them, because I believe now that I have given you this context, understanding archetypes will be a lot easier. And this is a context which readers are familiar with. I'm presuming that most of us over here are familiar with the Bollywood scene. And that is why I chose to approach archetypes through this path. So, what are archetypes? Now, let us look at what theorists have to say about archetypes. In fact, archetypes come from the if you break up the word, it is arche meaning original and topos meaning figure or imprint. So it's the original. So archetypes are prototypes, originals of characters, situations, and encounters that then keep recurring to indicate a pattern. I'm going to request our participants not to fiddle too much with their screen pen. Participants who are constantly raising their hands, and there are participants who want to ask questions. So I just have one request, because it's the screen gets so crowded. I'm unable to see the matter on the slide. So if I can just request you to hold your questions till the end of the webinar, and then we could take as many questions as possible within the specified time limit, right? So participants, thank you for your enthusiasm, but if you could just hold your questions till the end of the webinar, it will be great. Right, so resuming the session. So archetypes are prototypes. They are originals of characters, situations, and encounters that then keep recurring to indicate a pattern. So they are original thoughts. They are embedded in our unconscious, and they are also projections of our unconscious, according to Carl Jung. So, in fact, sometimes stories that seem to be unheard of before, that appear new, but that resonate with us, and that seem to have a special appeal to us, are always invariably archetypal, and so are people. So when we feel deeply connected to something, or we feel that a pattern is familiar, we can rest assured that it is an archetype. And this is our collective unconscious, which is responding to the archetype. Now, what is collective unconscious? Jung defines it as collective residual memory or transcendental imagination. What he means by this is, now we are all familiar with Freud's notion of the individual unconscious or the subconscious, and he kind of proves his theory through the interpretation of dreams, and he goes on to say that we all have an individual unconscious where conscious thoughts, when repressed, go in the realm of the unconscious, and these unconscious thoughts are then expressed through slips or in the form of dreams. Now Jung says, yeah, Jung is not talking about individual unconscious, he's talking about collective unconscious, which he believes we inherit. It is hereditary. So, as a community, as a cultural collective, we have an unconscious memory. It is like, it's like, say, maybe some kind of an intranet, or some kind of an energy or a connection which binds all people of a community together. And a lot of actions which we perform in life, or a lot of decisions that we make, a lot of our responses are informed by this collective unconscious, right? So, and that is why certain situations, certain people, they resonate uh, with us, and we feel connected with them. Certain, we are drawn to certain types, we are repulsed by certain types, all because we are informed by a collective unconscious. So archetypes call out to something deep inside us that responds to them. Archetypal characters and mythic plots, thus they have an endless appeal. So if you look at Carl Jung's quote, and you have another quote by another theorist here, he says archetypes are that immense spiritual reservoir from which we draw all our fantasies, imaginations, dreams, delusions, myths, because myths are always collective in nature and they belong to a community, literary images and symbols, right? So this is how, and what you see on the screen are the 12 primary archetypes. But of course, archetypes we need to understand are evolving, and there are emergent archetypes also, depending on the socio-political cultural milieu which we live in, right? Now, these are some more thoughts by Jung, and you can read it for yourself, because there's no point if something is on the slide, I should not be reading it out again, because it will be a repetition. So Jung is, now these are, of course, they are approaching the idea of myths and archetypes from a symbological, psychological perspective. I'm not looking at literary theorists here, or I'm not looking at linguists over here, like Claude Levi-Strauss or Roland Barthes, who have a very different take on myths and archetypes. So we are looking at the Jungian framework. And you have another very important um, uh, person who has done a lot of work in myths and archetypes, who is Joseph Campbell, right? So archetypes, and then we have this amazing person, Caroline Myss, who is a very, very effective orator. And if you want to have a very simple understanding of archetypes, I will strongly recommend you to read her or to listen to her audiobooks. It's very refreshing. So archetype, uh, she makes it very simple. And I realize that it's just a more difficult word to understand a less difficult idea. So I'm just going to make it very application based, and I'm going to ask you to relate yourself to archetypes. We all live with archetypes, in fact. We embody them, we engage with them, and we are attracted or repulsed by them. The only thing is, we don't know that they are archetypes. When we tend to label people or classify them or categorize them or use a certain set of adjectives, descriptive words or synonyms or phrases to talk about them, or even to maybe badmouth them behind their back, what we are referring to is their archetypal quality. So, for instance, when we predict about a person with comments like, I think she will understand, she's very empathetic, or, oh, I'm sure she will turn this to her advantage, she's a very big opportunist. Or when you have to speak about yourself and say, I am more of a recluse, I'd rather be at home with a book and a cup of coffee, and I'm not a party animal. Or when you say, I get bored too soon, I have to hop from project to project, I can't stick to one place for very long. What we are actually describing is an archetype. We may have heard people say things like, I am in my element when I'm doing this, or this is me, or more commonly, it's in my blood. It most certainly is, as we are actually hearing them express an archetype. Archetypes are original and primal, but they can be new and emergent archetypes too, like I just said. There is always the possibility of including more and more archetypes because they are there and they evolve over time, manifesting recurrently and variously. So, in fact, one way of understanding what your archetype is to identify your always characteristics. What do I always do? What do I never do? So, something which you could never do, which you can't imagine in your wildest dreams, is definitely not your archetype. And something which you always do, invariably, despite other people telling you to do different things, you always fall back on that one thing, then definitely that is your calling and that is your archetype. So, in fact, there are theorists who believe that archetypes are these deep psychic structures embedded in our unconscious, and they predate us, they pre-exist us, and we are born with archetypes and we are born into them. And of course, the theory is debatable, and you can approach it at as an intellectual, and you can deconstruct it, but I'm just presenting to you what theorists say, right? So, going back to emergent archetypes, now, for example, there is the archetype. Now, you have this eternal mother archetype. Now, the mother archetype has a lot of, there are a lot of archetypal mothers in the family of the mother archetype. Like you have the nurturing mother, the devouring mother. Then you have the dual mother, the foster mother. You also have the working mother. Now, this is an archetype which is an emergent archetype, right? Because there was no concept of the working mother till women actually started stepping out of their homes and started entering the public sphere in a big way, in a more organized way. So now we have the working mother archetype. So this was just to give you an example of how archetypes constantly evolve. Now, going back to films, in fact, Hindi films or Bollywood is incomplete without the mother archetype. Now, if I have to ask you, who comes to your mind when you have to think of the sacrificing mother, the mother who is powerless, who is abandoned, or who has been separated from her children and who is suffering? Who comes to your mind? I'll tell you. Uh, Nirupa Roy, right? And this is a quote from the print. You can read for yourself. She ruled the big screen for more than 2 decades as the suffering mother. She's the eternal archetypal suffering mother. And who does she remind you of from mythology? Of course, it's Kaushalya from Ramayana and Devki from Mahabharata. If you look at the mothers of our two primary gods, Ram and Krishna, both mothers were separated from their sons, and they were forcibly separated. It was not as if they gave up their sons, they were separated. They were violently separated from their sons, and their suffering becomes archetypal. And that is what you see being repeated by Nirupa Roy on the big screen. And it has a very strong appeal. In fact, you'll be surprised to know that storylines kept changing, actors kept changing, but the archetype of the suffering mother would remain constant. And Nirupa ji, in that role of the suffering mother, would remain constant. So she's the archetype of the enduring mother, the suffering mother, the mother who experiences pain all the time, right? Now, so this is the suffering mother archetype. Let me take you to another archetypal mother. I'm just going to do three with you because I mean, there are so many, but I've just chosen three because I like these three. There's the unwed mother in Bollywood. So Wahida Rahman, who in her youth captured the big screen through the avatar of the dancing girl, if you remember, in films like, so it was either the dancing girl or the courtesan in films like Guide, Mujhe Jeene Do, Tisri Kasam, goes on appropriately to symbolize the unwed mother of an illegitimate child who she's either forced to abandon or raise on her own. She is an unwed mother in Kabhi Kabhi who gives birth secretly to her child and abandons the child as she has to marry again. In Trishul, yet again, she is an unwed mother who is abandoned by a man with the wanderer archetype played by Sanjeev Kumar. And she has to raise a child on her own who grows up to avenge his mother's suffering. And he's, of course, Amitabh Bachchan. In the movie Sunny, she falls short. Wahida Rahman falls short of becoming the archetypal unwed mother as it is taken up by another female actor who controls a similar archetype. In fact, who connotes a similar construct with a courtesan past in some movies like Amar Prem, and that is Sharmila Tagore. And she has also been an illegitimate mother, like in Aradhana. Right? So she brings to mind, and also she plays some kind of a, you know, sex worker. She has that sex worker image in the film Mosam. So she brings to mind now these women who capture the popular imaginary so strongly with the unwed mother archetype, Sharmila Tagore and Wahida Rahman. Who do they bring to your mind from mythology? Who are you reminded of? Of course, it's Kunti from the Mahabharata, right? And her predicament as an unwed mother, as she gives birth to Karna, who is which is a child out of wedlock, and she obviously has to abandon this first child of hers. Uh, Moving on, you have the avenging mother, and this is an archetype I personally like a lot, probably because we are not very familiar with the mythological figure this archetype borrows from. Now, just as Nirupa Roy is the trope of the eternally wronged mother in Bollywood, Rakhi in many ways epitomizes the avenging, strong, resilient mother who refuses to accept physical or emotional defeat. Her portrayal of the actively avenging mother in films like Shraddhanjali and Saugandh, and the passively avenging mother in films like Karan Arjun and Ram Lakhan, reaches a subliminal high as she metamorphoses from revenge to sacrifice with realization in films like Border, just like the archetype she essays. And I'm going to trace this on screen journey of Rakhi uh, through the mythological journey of the mythological figure, the archetype she embodies, which is a lesser known mythological figure called Diti. Now, who is Diti? Diti and Aditi are daughters of Brahma, and they are married to Kashyap Rishi, right? So it is believed that Aditi is the mother of all the devas and Diti is the mother of all the asuras, right? So we all know that the devas and asuras are engaged in an eternal battle. They are perennially at conflict with each other. And the Trinity, the Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh Trinity, always favors the devas. And though the asuras do severe penance and they perform austerities and they get boons, somehow or the other they are vanquished, if not by the devas, then by the Devi, the the one of the avatars of the Mahadevi. So Diti is the silently suffering mother because she keeps losing her sons, whereas Aditi is riding tall and proud on the glory of her sons, right? So Diti, in fact, feels very unfairly treated because her sons either die or they are deprived of their rightful claim to things. Like, for example, if you look at the myth of the Samudra Manthan, where the Devas and the Asuras, they churn the Kshir Sagar or the Milky Ocean, and the pot of Amrit that comes out along with a lot of other things. Vishnu assumes the form of the seductress Mohini, and he takes off with the pot to make sure that only the Devas get the elixir and not the Asuras. So Diti wants her revenge, and she offers prayers, she does penance to give birth to a son who can kill Indra, because Indra is her biggest enemy. He is the king of the gods. And so she wants a child who can kill Indra. And she goes to her husband, Kashyap Rishi, with this wish of hers, who obviously is reluctant to aid her in the fulfillment of this wish. Nonetheless, he relents, but he lays down so many terms and conditions for her. He gives her a list of austerities that have to be observed, and Diti is very determined. So she is pregnant with a child, and she starts observing the austerities because she's about to give birth to a son who can vanquish Indra. Now, news obviously reaches Indra because Indra is a very good networker. He has his spies everywhere. And Indra comes to know that, what Diti is up to. So, what he does is he takes up the guise of a servant boy and he goes to Diti in this guise, and he offers to serve her. He says, I will serve you. And he doesn't tell her, of course, he's Indra. And Diti is very happy with the servant boy, and he looks after her, and he is always with her, obviously, because he is waiting for that one lapse when she forgets one ritual. And that is the time when she's vulnerable and he can kill the child in her. So, and the time comes, Diti is in her advanced stage of pregnancy. And what happens is one day she forgets a ritual. Uh, it's different myths have different, mention it differently. Some say that she forgets to wash her feet before going to sleep, or some say, she falls asleep with her wet hair and the water falls on her feet. So there are different versions, but anyways, it's something which she does which is not supposed to be done as per Kashyap Rishi's conditions. And that is the time when Indra enters her womb with his thunderbolt, and he slices up her fetus, her unborn child in her womb. Look at the violence. And the fetus starts crying when it's wounded. He slices it into 7 little pieces, and the fetus starts crying. And it says, it starts wailing. So Indra obviously is flustered, and he says, Maruda, Maruda, don't cry. And he slices them up further, each piece into 7 further pieces. So that's 49 pieces in all. And of course, by then Diti has woken up. Indra comes out of her womb, and he's all apologies and forgiveness. And he says, Mother, please forgive me. I was looking out for myself, but now you can punish me whichever way you want. And Diti realizes that now that her fetus has been sliced into 49 children, she gives birth to 49 sons, but each individually does not have that strength to vanquish Indra. So she tells Indra, you take all my children, they will be your followers from today, and they come to be known as the Maruts, from the word Maruda, from the phrase Maruda. So, in fact, Diti hands over her children in the service of Indra, the very man who had killed her other children, because she is powerless. So she goes from an avenging mother to a succumbing mother, just as Rakhi does, from movies like Saugand, Shraddhanjali, Ram Lakhan, and Karan Arjun to Border, who sacrifices her son for the good of the nation state. So here, nation state equates Indra, right? And lives with the loss of her only son. Now, in Border, Rakhi is also blind, symbolically suggesting that she can't really see or comprehend the larger politics of the nation state, which, in its pursuit to territorialize, sacrifices many such sons as Indra did, right? So, in each of these mother archetypes, if you observed carefully, I recalled a myth, a figure from myth. So, what are myths? Myths are stories that house archetypes. Different archetypal qualities of the same character come through or are foregrounded through different myths. And like archetypes, myths also have a timeless appeal because they also have a didactic purpose. They will tell you what ought to be, how life ought to be, rather than how life is. Now, a simple way of looking at myth, as Robert Segal does, is to regard it as a story with a certain argument or a point to make. And he says it's the most common way of understanding gods, heroes, villains, in other words, archetypes. It is also a credo that, or something that embeds an archetypal situation, like a rags to riches kind of credo, or overpowering the monster and things like that. Now, Carl Jung also says, has his perception and his own definition of myth. He says it is the primordial worldview, and in fact, the primitive man had to justify whatever was happening around him. So, myth is also about meaning making, right? So, if you are looking at the sun, which is rising, the primitive man is looking at the sun, which rises in the east and sets in the west. For the primitive man, this is not enough. It has to be the hero's journey, right? Where the sun is a god who is traveling on his chariot from one end to the other end of the cosmos, right? So myths in that regarded in that light would be stories which encode complex messages, which could be talking about cosmic phenomena, natural phenomena, physical phenomena, or even social phenomena, where you have myths like the conflict between good and evil, the exile myth, the myth of foster parenting, the myth of pride crushed, or the abduction myth, the myth of transgressive love, the myth of uh, matricide, patricide, so many myths, so which are also projections of repressed thoughts in the unconscious, right? So they are a they have a meaning making objective. If you read Joseph Campbell, you will see how he goes behind the logic of rituals and myths of the ancient tribes and tribal communities, and how he tries to convey what the rituals, which, for example, the hunter gatherer communities perform, where the animal is superior to the human being, right? So even before setting out to hunt, they will have the animals outline drawn on the wall of a mountain, and in such a position, in such an angle where the first rays of the sun fall on this outline of the animal, and then the hunter removes a bow and he takes out his bow and arrow, and he takes an aim and he shoots the animal, and that is how his hunting expedition is going to start. And then the the ritual of after having killed the animal, how a portion of the meat of the animal is also offered to the animal, whether it's a bear or whether it's a buffalo, because it's all about resurrecting the animal. So there are so myths and rituals are also to absolve man of his of his deep sense of guilt, the very action of life feeding upon life, which is also a very recurrent motif in Indian mythology. So these are the functions of myth. And in fact, now I am going to look at films. I know I did insert a little bit of theory, but I don't want to make it so heavy. So I'm going to see how films which have I'm going to share with you how things which have a mythical core are more successful and they are more enduring. So let's look at this film. I'm sure all of you are familiar with this film. You must have watched it at least once in your lifetime. This is the 70s Ramesh Sippy blockbuster multi-starrer Sholay, and it has a continuing appeal even today, even in contemporary times. Now, Sholay embeds in its storyline the plot of the epic Ramayana. Jay and Viru, the two outlaws, are in a kind of exile, just as Ram and Lakshman, who are hired by Thakur Baldev Singh, played by Sanjeev Kumar, to destroy the deadly chief of dacoits, Gabbar Singh, played by Amjad Khan, who is the villain of the story, just like Ravan is the antagonist of Ramayana. In fact, Gabbar even abducts Basanti and takes her to his lair, just like Ravan took off with Sita. In the battle that ensues, Jay perishes at the hands of the dacoits, just like Lakshman is hurt by Meghnad's Vasavi Shakti, his weapon in the Ramayana. Though Jay and Viru are outlaws and small time thugs who keep breaking the law and serving sentences, there is something noble and elevating about these two men. They are men with a good conscience, but men with their weaknesses too, which can be conveniently attributed to their circumstances, as they may have been orphaned at an early age, or they may have been forced to resort to unlawful activities from their childhood because they grew up in adversity. Their parents are conspicuously absent. Now, the two convicts, in the course of their mission, are brought from the margins and assimilated in the mainstream. And this is repeatedly evident through the actions of the Thakur. The Thakur has two sons, we come to know in the course of the narrative, both of whom are killed by Gabbar and his men. So he brings in two men who will substitute his two sons. He gives them quarters in the premises of his own property, which in itself is symbolic of his trust in them and accommodating them in his social and familial space. He is also not entirely indifferent towards his daughter's feelings for Jay and even implies getting her remarried. This is how the project of mainstreaming the marginalized characters of Jay and Viru is accomplished, and new versions of Ram and Lakshman are birthed. Sholay, besides positioning and branding Amjad Khan as a villain par excellence with pathological and sadistic overtones unprecedented in Indian cinema till then, also celebrates the eternal bonding of two male friends, which is immortalized through the song Ye Dosti Hum Nahi Todenge. This celebration is yet another appeal to the collective unconscious by recalling the myth of male bonding and brotherly love so apparent in our epics, whether you take the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, or even the kind of complementary relation seen in the Holy Trinity of Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh. Now, moving on, let me show you another example. A similar such mythological strain is identified in the highly successful 2001 Amir Khan starrer Lagan, Once Upon a Time in India, which is a film set in colonial India. Now, if you see, the entire film swivels around an impossible wager between the righteous and wronged natives, represented by a very enterprising and brave young villager Bhuvan, which is played by Amir Khan, and an oppressive and autocratic and headstrong British officer, Captain Andrew Russell, bringing to mind the wager between the Pandavas and the Kauravas, which led to the Battle of Kurukshetra. Lagan's wager is also followed by a battle, only on the cricket ground, where eventually the righteous win and the corrupt colonial power stands to lose. So it has two strong myths: that of the conflict between good and evil, where good emerges victorious and good triumphing over evil in the end, and also that of an impossible wager. Now, A.K. Ramanujan, in his essay, The Repetition in the Mahabharata, he says that the Mahabharata provides materials and allusions to every artistic genre, from plays to proverbs, from folk performances to movies and TV. Modern plays like Girish Karnad's Yayati in Kannada and Dharamveer Bharti's Andha Yug in Hindi, and Shyam Benegal's film Kalyug, and more recently Rajniti, all draw from the Mahabharata, right? So this was just to give you an example of how when movies have a mythical center, they tend to do better, they tend to resonate better with people, and they tend to appeal to the collective unconscious in us, which has all these myths embedded in it, right? Now, moving on, let's look at some common myths in Bollywood or in Indian films. Now, often we have critics commenting on the Indian masala movie genre. By the way, I have to mention to you over here Manmohan Desai, who was a very famous filmmaker. And once he was interviewed, and the interviewer asked him. In fact, Manmohan Desai is the man who has been credited for the creation of the genre of the Bollywood masala movie with his 1977 multi-starrer release Amar Akbar Anthony. So once Manmohan Desai was asked by an interviewer, "What are your movies about?" And he replied, "Every film of mine is about the Mahabharata." So there is some element of the Mahabharata in every film of his. And even if you were to take Amar Akbar Anthony, for instance, you have such strong elements of the Mahabharata in the film. If you look at Amar, who is the child who is raised by Hindu parents, he emblematizes law. He is the epitome of law. He's also a police officer, very righteous, very ethical, and he brings to mind Yudhishthir, who is the eldest brother of the Pandavas. Then you have other themes in Amar Akbar Anthony, like children who are separated from their parents and then reunited, foster parenting. Then you have brothers coming together to fight and destroy evil. So all of these are themes which are universal in their own way, but which draw very heavily from the Mahabharata. Now, coming back to some popular myths or archetypal patterns in Hindi films, critics often have problems with song and dance sequences, and often these song and dance sequences seem illogical because the narrative is going in a certain direction, and suddenly there's a song, and it could be shot abroad in a foreign location, and we don't know what to make of the song because uh, the heroine are dancing around the trees, and dancing around the tree did become a very common phrase, right? So where does it come from? Now, apart from the fact that the Hindi film, the Bollywood genre, draws, or Indian cinema as such, draws very strongly from a rich tradition of dance drama, of jatra, of yakshaganas, of a lot of traditional theater and narratives which used to incorporate dance and music in them. That is why we can't have a film without the element of music. It is also true that from a mythological and an archetypal perspective, if you see, it draws from Krishna's Ras Leela, which would always be in in the middle of the night and with lots of trees in an enclosure which was surrounded by trees, where Krishna is dancing. In fact, there's one Krishna with every gopi, and it's time has come to a standstill, and it's an eternal kind of romance, right? Which is also something which the Hindi movie tries to capture. And I think it also enables its audience to escape into the unreal and fantastic land, a space which where you can have that, you can enjoy and experience that transgressive love, which kind of gives you it's an escape valve from the oppressive, not, maybe, I mean, I shouldn't be using the word oppressive, but slightly controlling institution of arranged marriage. So transgressive love is one very prominent and dominant theme in Hindi films, and probably it draws from the Krishna Radha stories and all the poetry of the Bhakti poets who dwelled on it for a very long time. You have very rich literature, and also, of course, the description of the Krishna Leela, Ras Leela, sorry. Yes. Then the abduction archetype. We already saw this archetype. It is very prominent in the Ramayana, where Ravan takes off with Sita. And practically, there was a time in the 1960s and 70s, practically every alternate Hindi film had the abduction myth in it, where the villain takes the lead female actor to his lair, and then the hero comes and he decimates the villain's gangs single-handedly, and he frees the woman. Of course, it also draws from the damsel in distress archetype. Like I said, many of these archetypes are universal. And whatever myths I have described or shared with you, many of them have Western parallels also, right? Sometimes there are universal parallels also. So abduction archetype is another strong recurring archetypal situation in films. And then there is a separation and reunion archetype. Now, I could accommodate only these many films, but if you bear these archetypal patterns in mind, and if you watch films with this informed consciousness, I'm sure you will find and discover a lot more archetypal patterns and many more films which have these archetypal patterns. Like you have all these films where the children are separated from their biological parents at birth, and they grow up unaware of their biological parents, and they grow up with different identities sometimes, and then finally they are reunited with their biological parents, right? It could be either a father or a mother sometimes, or it could be both parents at times. Right, so these are some of the common myths and archetypal patterns in films. And if you are interested in reading further, I am going to, this is just some books which I kind of try to accommodate on this slide, but there are a lot many books out there which make for a very interesting read. But I will strongly recommend Archetypes, Who Are You, and Language of Archetypes by Carolyn Mees, because I said it's an easy read, and uh, it's very interesting. It's you get the notion of myths and archetypes very quickly. Of course, canonical reads would be Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell. You can see Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces. He has also written The Hero's Journey. You have Maureen Murdoch's The Heroine's Journey. And then you have this book called Myth, a very short introduction by Robert A. Segal, which is a great book to look at intersections of myth with other disciplines, or the influence of other disciplines over myth. And then, of course, if you are looking at Hindu myths, and especially the myths of Hindu goddesses, I think this is a very interesting read by David Kinsley. So these are some of the books which I could, I mean, kind of accommodate on this slide, but there are many more out there, like I said. And India is a land which is very rich in myths and archetypes. Some of the myths are, of course, universal in nature, but there are myths and archetypes which are very particular also. There is the big tradition, and there are also the little traditions, the regional myths, the village lore, the rituals, which we may not be even aware of because they are not hegemonic. So there's a whole world out there to explore and to draw from. And all I can say is that myths, in fact, kind of they seek to justify things. They seek to they are engaged in a meaning making enterprise, and the world and existence divested of myth would amount to the absurd. So if you look at absurd and if you look at myths, I mean, I see them as kind of diametrically opposite, right? Where you had philosophers like Sartre saying that life is meaningless and I can never understand what the tree is because there is a tree next to it and I cannot be it. So it's a thing in itself, not for itself. And since I cannot be it, that creates the sense of nausea in me. That is the whole crux of the, and that leads to the feeling of the absurd. So that's the whole existentialist perspective. And on the other hand, you have myth, where you look at the tree and you acknowledge the presence of some form of life in it. You acknowledge its journey. You acknowledge it as a mode of being, as a way of being, and you sense a different kind of life in it. And that's how myth making starts. So I think I will leave you with those thoughts, and just leave you with this idea that maybe everywhere around us, if we start noticing, we will find archetypal qualities in ourselves, in the people around us, and archetypal patterns which keep recurring, right? So that is the end of my talk. And thank you so much for being in this room today and for your wonderful response and for turning out in such great numbers. Thank you so much. Yes, I can hear you.
So, we have lot of participants, distinguished participants who have widely appreciated. And to begin with, one question that has been asked by one of our participants, Dr. Varghese John from Bangalore. His question is, if archetypes appeal to something universal within human, should it be seen as normative and socio-biologically determined, or should we understand it as being culturally specific?
Very nice question. In fact, like Singh sir also said, that archetypes, if you invest too much in archetypes, you do tend to fall, or you are in the danger of falling into a trap of essentialism, because archetypes are classifying categories. But I would say that you can look at them as discursive and evolving patterns, because any archetype will have any figure or any character will have multiple archetypes in them. So, for example, if you look at Indian mythology, we think of goddess, the goddesses, for example, Lakshmi as the archetypal goddess of wealth and bounty, Parvati as the archetypal goddess of fertility. Now, we can approach these archetypes discursively, and we can try to locate and find other archetypal qualities in them. So they not only symbolize these qualities, but there could be other archetypes like that of the queen, or the warrior, or the sage, or the seductress. So these are left to us. So when Carl Jung talks about archetypes, he says that these are unconscious, repressed patterns in our mind, but they acquire they are altered when they are projected by our unconscious mind. So the moment they are projected, they become conscious projections, and as conscious projections, then they are subject to multiple interpretations, and those multiple interpretations can of course be formed by discourses. So the idea is to trace different archetypes or different qualities, different patterns in these entities, and trying to understand that they are, after all, constructs, and they emerge from our cultural unconscious. Definitely, there could be some archetypes who are culturally specific, and there could be some which are universal. Now, Carl Jung was very clear when he posited this theory, and this was to treat patients basically. Where he and Freud parted ways was that Freud believed that all projections of the unconscious was owing to repressed sexual desires, and whereas Jung said that these projections and the dreams that one kind of sees when one is asleep is not just about one's repressed sexual desires, but they are also about the archetypes and the myths that are embedded in our conscious. So that was their basic point of departure, right? So Jung actually very religiously believed that we inherit our collective unconscious. It's hereditary. We are born with it. And now, of course, you can read him up further to contest this. But like I said, they can be discursively approached. So one way to bring together the structuralist and the post-structuralist theories would be to look at archetypes discursively, look at constructs as discursive entities, and locate not just one, but a cluster of archetypes in them, and then try and understand why a certain archetype is hegemonized in that construct. Probably because it was politically appropriate at that point in time. And here I will give you a very interesting example. For example, we all know what the serpent or the snake stands for in the biblical mythology. The serpent is Satan, and the snake, it stands for evil. And it's the serpent who gives the apple to Eve. But this was not always so. If you look at the goddess religions which existed before the northern invasions and before the advent of the patriarchal order, then you will see that the goddess is very closely associated with the serpent or the snake, because the serpent resides in primordial waters, and so does the goddess. So the serpent was a fertility symbol. The serpent was equated with the goddess. Now, with the northern invasions, what happened was they erased the goddess religions in the Near East and the Middle East, and in places like Sumeria and Egypt. They were in a predicament whether to assimilate the goddess religion or whether to obliterate it completely. And that is how, when they assimilated it, they projected their anxiety and they projected their negative, repressed emotions on the serpent. And that's how the serpent becomes a symbol of evil. If you're interested, you could read Merlin Stone's book, which is called When God Was a Woman. And she talks about how symbols acquire different connotations and how myths evolved, the origin of myths, patriarchal myths. So it's a very interesting read. Yes.
Thank you,
I
ma'am.
hope I've addressed your question.
Another question
Hmm.
by another participant, Mathangi ji, is
I can't hear you, sir.
ma'am,
Sir?
another question that has been raised by one of our participants, Mathangi ji, says
Huh?
more light to distinguish between
I can't
motifs.
hear you, sir. More, what is it, sir? More
Distinguish
distinguish?
between the archetypes and the motifs. Motifs.
The archetypes and the motifs. Now, the archetype motifs would be recurring religious symbols. Not religious just, but they could be any kind of symbols. Whereas archetypes would be more of qualities, right? Like when we say the sage archetype or the wise old man archetype, they are human qualities, or they could be situations. So archetypes give you a bigger discursive field to play on compared to motives. So, for example, when you consider, say, goddess Parvati, okay, so when you look at her, you consider her as an archetype, and you start understanding her and examining her as an archetype. But maybe the lion, her mount, which is the lion, is a motive, or or maybe the pot of gold which Lakshmi bears in her arms is a motive. So the iconography can sometimes change depending on what archetype, depending on which of the archetypes is foregrounded and hegemonized. So that's how archetypes are different from motives.
Another participant asked the question, how would we distinguish between where is the role of individual
Can't
variation?
hear you, sir. Hello?
Uh,
Sorry?
how, how do we account for the individual differences?
How do we account for the individual differences in archetypes?
Right.
Individual differences in archetypes. I didn't get it. How do we? Individual differences in archetypes would mean, because archetypes in themselves are categories, and there are families of archetypes. For example, for example, let's consider the creator family. So in the creator family, you can have the artist. In the artist family, you have the mad artist, the starving artist, the successful artist, the eccentric artist. So there are families of archetypes. So basically, it's a classifying pattern. Now, any person cannot have just one archetype in them. Similarly, any mythological figure cannot have just one archetype in them. They will be a cluster of archetypes. And in fact, there are theorists who say there are as many archetypes as there are human beings walking on planet Earth. And like I said, that archetypes are eternally emerging and they are evolving. In fact, Caroline Myss also talks about archetypes like the networker or the computer geek, which obviously could not have existed when during the time of the ancients, right? So like you have new myths and new mythology which Roland Barthes talks about, you also have new archetypes with their own individuality.
Really wish to thank you for such an interesting and engaging session. But to propose a formal vote of thanks, I would invite Dr. Isaac Ghosh.
Thank you, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and we can.
Okay. It is thank you for inviting me for the vote of thanks. Before I go to the vote of thanks, because of some technical glitches, I couldn't introduce the speaker, which I will now. It was an honor listening to the very talented, multifaceted personality, Dr. Shyaonti Talwar. She started her career at the age of 18 as a correspondent for the Times of India, then was associate editor of a magazine called Girls. And later on, interior design magazine, The Home Review. She has interviewed almost all the well-known artists of Bollywood, working as a film correspondent for Rediff and the Deccan Herald. She's a regular blogger and is a contributor to the Times of India and The Wire. Presently, she works as assistant professor of English at Bitco College, affiliated to Pune University, Maharashtra. She is the recipient of the National Award for Best Teacher 2014 at the 14th National Award ceremony organized by the National Education Society, Mumbai. Besides being a teacher of literature, having done her doctorate from the University of Mumbai, she's also a professionally qualified English language teacher, trainer, and educator, having a CELTA and TKT certification from Cambridge English Assessment, University of Cambridge, UK. She has trained extensively across India for the British Council, conducting principals and teachers training workshops on 21st century core skills that include critical thinking, creativity, and communication, student leadership, and digital literacy. She's a senior presenter of Cambridge English Assessment, a division of the University of Cambridge, and conducts teacher support programs and principal and coordinator seminars on Cambridge English exams and other areas of ELT in India and other South Asian countries. She's a mentor and trains, monitors, and evaluates presenters for Cambridge Assessment English. Dr. Talwar is also a resource person for the Oxford University Press, where she conducts regular workshops for school teachers across West India. Dr. Talwar has developed modules on teaching learning strategies and blended learning and flipped classroom for Swayam, the digital platform launched by the Government of India. She has also had a long and rich experience as a voiceover artist in English, Hindi, Marathi, and Bangla, and has lent her voice to documentaries, narratives, sound and music shows that includes ones from the Ministry of Finance, the School of Artillery, the Raymond's Group, to name a few. Dr. Talwar does a lot of work in the buffer zones of tiger reserves for Wildlife Conservation Trust training programs. Besides this, Dr. Talwar is a professionally qualified dancer in the Indian classical dance form Kathak, who received her talim from Guru Vidya Hari Deshpande, a disciple of Kathak maestro Pandit Birju Maharaj of the Lucknow Gharana. Dr. Talwar ran her own dance academy called Nrityangna for several years. She was chosen by Rotary International as a cultural ambassador and classical dance performer to Brazil, where she toured for a month, giving talks, performances, and presentations. She has also been one of the lead choreographers in the National Festival of Mauritius. Dr. Talwar has authored 2 books to her credit, and interestingly, one of them on mineral stones of the Deccan Plateau. This book is a part of the collection of reference books for minerals at the Smithsonian Museum, USA. She is presently working on her third book, which is on Indian female archetypes in myths and popular culture. Her doctoral dissertation aimed at a gendering of the absurd to a close textual analysis of 6 works of fiction by women authors. Her current areas of research interest include ELLT, gender studies, post-colonialism, culture studies, and myths and archetypes in popular culture. We would like to thank Dr. Talwar for the very engaging and informative talk and lecture that she gave us. She traced a few myths and archetypes that surround us today and are embedded in our films, and likewise traced the success stories of films and celebrities that have a mythic center or an archetypal core. Thank you very much, Dr. Talwar. I would also like to thank at this point of time our principal, Professor S.P. Singh, who has always been taking the initiative in hosting webinars and e-conferences, and for all his encouragement and support. I would like to thank the head of our English department, Dr. Oswald Simon, who is always an encouragement to us, to Dr. Melva Pope, and other faculty members of our department. Last but not the least, Dr. Sonal Sahe, who was handling the technical aspect of this webinar. Thank you very much. I hand over to Dr. Professor S.P. Singh.
Before we close, I'd really like to thank all the viewers who accepted our invitation, took the pains to register themselves, and really made it a delightful opportunity of interaction. So thank you all. Kunal, shall we close?